I'm working with the 20newsgroups dataset from Sklearn. It's a collection of text documents, and I'll use it for text classification. This function is the main tool. I use it to load the dataset. It has many options to customize the dataset's content. This is crucial. It lets me pick which newsgroups to include. I specify the names of the newsgroups I want as a list. For example, to get only comp, graphics and space newsgroups, I pass a list like this. Comp, graphics, space, The goal is to get only the comp, graphics and space categories from the dataset. I need to find the correct way to use the fetch20newsgroups function to do this. It's like picking specific apples from a huge orchard. I need to select specific newsgroups from the 20newsgroups dataset, namely, comp, graphics and space. The challenge is to write the right code to fetch only these. This is one way to do it. I use the categories parameter with a list of the desired categories. This is the most straightforward approach. Similar to option A, but I also specify subset equals, train, This limits the data to the training set, which is perfectly fine, even though it's not strictly required by the problem statement. This is incorrect. I'm specifying categories twice. The second specification overrides the first, leading to only space being selected. Oops. While this also works, the remove parameter is unnecessary. I could solve the problem without removing headers and footers. I'm overdoing it. It's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Both A and B are correct because they achieve the goal of selecting only the desired categories. I'm asking you to choose the correct code among the options given to load a specific subset of the 20 newsgroups dataset using Sklearn. We want only the documents related to comp, graphics, and space. Pretty straightforward, right? This code uses the function from Sklearn. I'm setting the subset parameter to train, meaning I only want the training data. The crucial part is, this tells the function to include only those two specific categories in the downloaded dataset. This is a perfectly acceptable way to solve the problem. This does exactly what the previous line does, but without specifying a subset. I'm loading the whole dataset, both training and testing data, but only keeping the documents from the comp, graphics and space categories. This also works correctly, and it's even slightly simpler. Good job. Here, I'm using the remove parameter to exclude headers and footers from the documents. Although this extra step isn't strictly necessary to select the categories, I'm still getting the desired categories, comp, graphics and space. This is still a valid solution but less concise. Look closely. I'm mistakenly using the categories parameter twice. The second one overwrites the first one. As a result, only the space category would be included. This is incorrect. This line simply states the overall task. We're working with the 20 newsgroups dataset, a collection of text documents used for machine learning tasks, especially text classification. The goal is to load only the comp, graphics, and space categories from the 20 newsgroups dataset using the fetch_20 newsgroups function from Sklearn. This is a text classification problem where you are selecting a subset of the data. I'm using the fetch_20 newsgroups function and passing a list of the desired categories, comp, graphics and space. This is the correct way to select specific categories. Is a function that fetches the 20 newsgroups dataset. Here, I'm doing the same as in option A, but also specifying subset equals, train, This loads only the training subset of the data. While it works, selecting only the categories is sufficient to answer the question. This is incorrect. I'm trying to use the categories parameter twice. Only the last categories specification, space, will be used, overriding the first one. This also works, but it's unnecessary. I'm specifying the categories correctly, but also adding remove equals, headers, footers, backquote, which removes header and footer information from the documents. This is not relevant to the core question. These are the multiple choice options for the question. Let's see how well you understand the options. I'm using the function from the Sklearn library. This function lets me download a dataset of text messages from 20 different newsgroups. The goal is to download only messages from 2 specific newsgroups: comp, graphics, and space. I need to figure out how to tell the function to do this. This line of code is perfect. I'm directly telling the function to only include the comp, graphics, and space categories using the backquote categories backquote parameter, which takes a list of category names. That's exactly what we need. This also works. It does the same as option A, but also adds a backquote subset backquote parameter set to train. This means I'll only get the training part of the dataset. While the question didn't explicitly ask for this, it's still a correct way to get just those 2 categories. This one is incorrect. I'm mistakenly using the backquote categories backquote parameter twice. The second one overwrites the first. Only space will be included, not both. Oops. This gets the right categories, but it adds extra backquote remove backquote parameter to get rid of headers and footers. That's not wrong, but it's not needed to answer the core question. We are only asked to select the correct categories. The question is simply asking you to identify which code snippets correctly include only comp, graphics, and space. I'm using the function from the Sklearn library. This function lets me download a famous dataset for text classification, the 20 newsgroups dataset. It's a collection of newsgroup messages, organized into different categories. This is the core question. I need to figure out which code snippet correctly selects only the comp, graphics, and space categories from the 20 newsgroups dataset. This line of code uses the function to download the dataset. I'm specifically telling the function to include only the categories comp, graphics, and space, using the backquote categories backquote parameter. This is a list of strings, each representing a category. This is correct. This is wrong because I'm trying to set the backquote categories backquote parameter twice. The second one overwrites the first one. This means only space will be selected, not both. The backquote categories backquote parameter is super important in the function. I use it to tell the function which categories I want to include in my dataset. It's a list of strings. This refers to the input data for the function. It's the 20 newsgroups dataset. This is the output of the function after using the backquote categories backquote parameter to filter the original dataset. I get a smaller dataset that contains only the specified categories. I'm focusing on how to pick specific categories from the backquote fetch_20 newsgroups backquote function in Sklearn. This function lets you download a collection of text documents, and I'll show you how to choose only the ones you need. The quiz tests your knowledge of how the backquote fetch_20 newsgroups backquote function works. I want you to pick the code that only grabs documents from comp, graphics, and space categories. This is perfect. You provide a list of categories, comp, graphics, space, directly to the backquote categories backquote parameter. This tells the function exactly which categories you want. This also works. It does the same thing as option A, but it also adds backquote subset equals train backquote. This just means you only download the training part of the dataset. The core function of selecting the categories remains the same. It's still a correct answer. Oh, here, you're trying to use the backquote categories backquote parameter twice. The second one overwrites the first, so it only keeps space. I want both categories. This one is wrong. This one's tricky. It correctly selects your categories, but also removes headers and footers. While not incorrect, it's extra. I only asked for the correct categories, not extra steps. A and B are both correct, because they successfully select both comp, graphics, and space categories. C is wrong because it only keeps one category. D is correct in getting the right categories but does extra work. Option B is still correct. even though it adds unnecessary complexity. It still fulfills the requirement perfectly. I'm asking you to pick the correct code that loads only the comp, graphics and space categories from the 20 newsgroups dataset using scikit-learn's _fetch_20 newsgroups function. It's a multiple-choice question testing your understanding of the function's parameters. Think carefully about how you specify categories. This is a parameter of the _fetch_20 newsgroups function. I use this parameter to tell the function which specific categories of newsgroup data I want to include. You provide a list of category names as strings, like this. Comp, graphics, space, This is an optional parameter for _fetch_20 newsgroups It allows you to specify whether you want only the training data, train, or only the testing data, test, or both. This is useful if you are building a machine learning model and want to separate data for training and testing purposes. These are the possible values for the subset parameter. Train gives you the training dataset, while test gives you the testing dataset. You can ignore this unless you specifically need only one or the other. This is another optional parameter for _fetch_20 newsgroups I use it to remove things like email headers and footers from the newsgroup articles in the loaded dataset. It's useful for cleaning up your data, but it doesn't directly affect which categories are selected. You can remove headers and footers using a tuple. Headers, footers, This is a Python list that contains the names of two specific categories from the 20 newsgroups dataset: comp, graphics and space. These are the categories you want to include in your dataset. The categories parameter takes a list like this one to tell it which categories to include. This describes the overall topic: selecting data from the scikit-learn 20 newsgroups dataset. Scikit-learn is a popular machine learning library in Python. The 20 newsgroups dataset is a collection of newsgroup posts used for text classification tasks.